Hi everybody, welcome to week 7 where we are going to discuss operant conditioning, specifically the consequences involved in operant conditioning. My hope is that a good portion of this lecture is review for you. However, there is going to be some new material covered. The reason why this review is going to be so important is because consequences are such a foundation concept, and really understanding the different processes involved with consequences, it will help you in whatever you decide to do within a behavior analytic field. It's really important that you're fluent with these concepts. So if, as I'm going through information, that I'm not going to cover as much, or just bringing up some type of term that you don't understand, I very much encourage you to either contact me and I can lead you towards the course or some material that will help you, or to go back into some of your previous courses to really make sure that you're getting an in-depth understanding of these concepts. Also, make sure to look at the resource material covered in Cooper, because I have the chapters listed there that you can read and refresh. Sometimes it's really good to go back and reread or re-talk about things that you've talked about many times before. I've actually, in my career, gone to a number of different intro workshops years and years later, because sometimes the different concepts will seem a little bit different. And I will start to be able to pay attention to different sources of control, or just get a different idea of really what's talking about. So let's get started. Like last week, let's review. Why does behavior occur? There are 3 potential reasons, and I hope you all said it's either going to be a reflexive relationship, there will be a history of responding conditioning, or a history, obviously, of operant conditioning, which is what we're talking about today. It may also be important to remember that these different conditioning paradigms can also come together, where behavior that was previously conditioned respondently can fall under operant control. When we talk about operant conditioning, we're obviously talking about the 3-term contingency. This 3-term contingency is an independent operant. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about that antecedent piece, where we'll start to question the contingency itself. However, today, what are we interested in? The consequences. And essentially what operant conditioning is known as is learning through consequences. So we learn that behaving in one way in certain conditions will have a certain result, and behaving in another way will not, or have a different result. Speaking of consequences, what 2 potential types of consequences are there to behavior, or that will have an effect on behavior? I'm pretty sure everybody went with, everybody went with reinforcement and punishment. All right, right now I'd like you to take a minute and write down the definition of reinforcement. It should actually take less than a minute. Okay, I hope you have something along the lines of a stimulus change contingent on behavior that increases the probability of that behavior occurring in the future. Now, some things to remember about reinforcement that are really important is reinforcement is the principle that when that stimulus change occurs contingent on behavior, behavior will increase. The stimulus change itself would then be considered a reinforcer. So if we think about our friend the rat here on the right, what we're looking at is the food presented contingent on a lever press will increase the likelihood that the lever press will occur again in the future. Presentation of the food, stimulus change, behavior, lever press. Outcome, increase lever pressing in the future. That's how I would want you to make sure you're thinking about reinforcement. Make sure that you have the stimulus change, the behavior, and the effect on behavior. If you do not have all these three things, you are not talking about reinforcement. So let's take a second and determine whether this is an example of reinforcement or not. It's a situation where it's late at night and you walk into a dark room. You feel along the wall and your hand contacts a light switch. You push up with the heel of your hand and the light comes on. Yes or no? Now thinking about that, we want to make sure we have the behavior, the stimulus change, and the future change or the outcome of behavior. So looking at this, I would say there are two behaviors. Everybody have them? Okay. The feeling along the wall and the pushing up with the heel of your hand. So let's go to the pushing up with the heel of your hand. You push up with the heel of your hand and the light turns on. Light turning on would be the stimulus change. Absolutely, so we have that. Do we have anything talking about the increased probability or the increase of heel of your hand pushing up? No. So this could not be considered an example of reinforcement. In order to make an example, just adding a sentence like that. Most likely we could say that pushing up with the heel of your hand may have happened because in the past that has resulted in the light turning on. However, that would have been an assumption. One thing you definitely want to pay attention to is when there are examples like this. If someone asked you a question like, why did you push up with the heel of your hand? The answer is not because you wanted light or because you needed light. That's telling the future, right? The correct way to say that would be that you pushed up with the heel of your hand because in the past, pushing up when there was a light switch resulted in light. That would indicate that reinforcement had occurred in the past. All right, so I want you to take a minute and write your own example of reinforcement. Make sure you have the behavior, the stimulus change, and the effect or the outcome. All right. Feel free to take longer. You can pause the lecture if you'd like to. But some things that I want to make sure you're considering. If, in your example, there is anything about wanting, desiring, in order to get, anything like that, you want to change it to talking about in the past, not telling the future. If you are questioning whether there's behavior, stimulus, change, and effect, also something you want to work on. If anybody would like to send me their examples, I'd be more than willing to workshop them for you. But there are also some other things that I'm assuming at this point you know about reinforcement or you have the resources to get. The first one is whether the reinforcement is positive or negative. At this point, it should be really well established that the stimulus change following a behavior is the presentation or the appearance or the addition of the stimulus for positive reinforcement. For a behavior to be reinforced positively, something needs to be added, right? So in our example before, the light was added to the room. In order for negative reinforcement to occur, there needs to be something subtracted or removed. Sometimes I don't like using terms presented and removed because it sounds like there is someone else doing it. That's not the case all of the time. So if you use added, subtracted, whatever word works for you is completely fine. But basically it's the removal. You have to be paying attention to the removal or the addition of a stimulus is the only thing that makes it positive or negative. And I know at this point no one is using the term positive or negative to indicate something good or bad. At this point, I also think that you've come in contact with the terms unconditioned, conditioned, and generalized conditioned reinforcers, where these types of reinforcers will often be referred to as primary or secondary as well. So in this situation, which picture do you think signals an unconditioned reinforcer? And even though my picture is a picture of someone drinking a glass of water, the thought is that water could be a primary or unconditioned reinforcer, where the reinforcer has its reinforcing effectiveness without any learning or conditioning. How about which of the other two pictures would show a potential conditioned reinforcer as opposed to a generalized conditioned reinforcer? Let me clear that up. And for some people, that necklace may reinforce behavior. And most likely there was some type of conditioning process that occurred. One way to think about this is most likely infants may not engage in behavior that would result in necklace, or that it wouldn't necessarily increase their rate of responding. So some type of learning would have been involved. Another word for that would be a secondary reinforcer. When we look at the credit cards, credit on credit cards or potential gift cards, money and all could be examples, or are very frequently examples of generalized conditioned reinforcers, where their reinforcing effectiveness comes because of all the potential reinforcers, other unconditioned and conditioned reinforcers that they can lead to. The one important thing that I hope everybody remembers about this is that with generalized conditioned reinforcers, motivating operations are generalized conditioned reinforcers are less sensitive to motivating operations, which we'll talk about a little bit next week. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Is this statement a statement that could be correct? Okay, she raised her hand because she knew she would be reinforced, or get reinforced, excuse me. I'm going to tell you right now, not correct. And there's a couple reasons why it's incorrect. So take a second and write down however many errors you see in the sentence. Okay, right off the bat, she knew she would get reinforced. Is a person reinforced? No. My guess is the hand raising had been reinforced. So that's error number one. Error number two is the knowing. Reinforcement or the reinforcement contingency does not need to be understood or known, or the person does not need to be aware of the reinforcing contingency in order for reinforcement to occur. This is referred to as automaticity of reinforcement. And then the last reason is somewhat how we talked about things before, in that this is telling the future, that something happened because something was going to happen, as opposed to she raised her hand because in the past that had resulted in reinforcement. Good. All right, so looking at this sentence, still on things that you should know, is this a true statement? Any behavior can be reinforced. And it actually is true. One thing that can be kind of a myth about reinforcement is that more behaviors or the form of different forms of behavior are more sensitive to reinforcement. And it's really not a case of sensitivity. Sometimes it's difficult for humans to arrange contingencies of reinforcement with certain behaviors. But in the lawfulness sense, or the lawfulness of behavior, if there's a reinforcement contingency that is established, a behavior can be reinforced. So thinking about it, that you're probably engaging in breathing as a reflexive relation. But if I said, hold your breath, and in the past, holding your breath had been reinforced, or following directions from a professor had been reinforced, you may engage in that response. So things, number of behaviors can come under operant control, or all behaviors, all forms of behavior can. It's just a matter of if we can gain control and establish those contingencies effectively. Another thing or concept related to reinforcement that you should really be rather fluent with is the difference between automatic and socially mediated reinforcement. These pictures show a number of situations that could potentially be automatically reinforced, or a number of behaviors that might be automatically reinforced, and a behavior that may be socially mediated. So looking at the first picture of the man rubbing his neck, do you think that this behavior is automatically reinforcing, or that the behavior has been automatically reinforced, or reinforced socially mediated, reinforced socially, excuse me? My guess would be that there's some type of automatic reinforcement where he's engaged in that behavior, and in the past it has resulted in some type of, release of muscle tension or something like that. What about the picture of the person putting keys in the car? Again, I would probably explain this, or guess if I had the data to support it, that this behavior has also been reinforced automatically, that the key in the car and turning resulted in typically results in a car turning on, so they're more likely to do it in the future. This is an example where the automatic reinforcement is actually mechanical. So it's not the result of the behavior directly, like rubbing your muscle, but the result of the mechanical result that results. What about the picture of someone handing someone else tickets? Most likely this is socially mediated. There are two people involved and there's an exchange occurring. And last but not least, the person blowing the bubble. Honestly, we don't have any context here. So a situation where it would be automatically reinforcing, or where automatic reinforcement would be occurring, is if the feeling of the bubble blowing, the sight of the bubble blowing, the popping of the bubble has reinforced bubble blowing behavior in the past. A situation where this may be socially mediated reinforcement is where potentially she's sitting in class and a teacher delivers a reprimand, and in the past this has happened and made the bubble blowing more likely to occur. Probably not the intention of the teacher, but still an example of reinforcement. Intention does not matter. All right, so let's move on to a couple of things that may be new or that you might not have heard as much about as some of the other things we've already discussed. There are some suggested side effects of reinforcement and unwanted side effects of reinforcement. The research has not been that extensive with humans, but it has been suggested. And it's funny because sometimes we think about unwanted side effects of extinction or punishment that we're going to talk about later, but unwanted side effects of reinforcement, because it results in the increase of behavior, is not always kind of forefront on our mind. So one of the things that you really want to think about is schedule-induced behavior. When a stimulus change is contingent on behavior, any behaviors that kind of become a part of that schedule may also be reinforced. So thinking about it, if anybody has ever run a discrete trial, and before you can deliver that really potent reinforcement following a behavior, the student starts to scratch their nose. And what can happen is the nose scratching can be reinforced. I'll let you know that not paying attention to schedule-induced behavior has resulted in a number of different odd behaviors for some of my clients in the past that you don't necessarily realize, or you haven't detected or identified the contingency where there's something else occurring when reinforcement is delivered. Also, sometimes behaviors can happen at the same time as the target response, and therefore they also contact reinforcement. Remembering that whatever behaviors are occurring or have just occurred when reinforcement is delivered or when a stimulus is removed will contact reinforcement, not just that intended response. So this can be really important to pay attention to. Also, there might be changes in members of the same response class. So in a situation where behavior is being targeted and there are really dense schedules of reinforcement being delivered for one member of a response class, other members of that response class may decrease in similar situations if their schedules of reinforcement are not maintained. Additionally, there can be other situations where reinforcing one member of a response class can result in increased frequency of other members of the response class. So that's really important to pay attention to as well. Lastly, that we'll talk about a little bit more next week is that when behaviors contact reinforcement pretty densely, satiation can occur, which then will affect that behavior as well as members of the same response class. All of these are definitely considerations to pay attention to when behavior is being reinforced unprogrammed, and also when we're programming for behaviors to be increased. Another thing that I'd like you to consider is negative reinforcement, which we don't talk about as often, I don't find, as positive reinforcement. So thinking about negative reinforcement, in order for negative reinforcement to occur, what needs to be true before a response would occur? Thinking that we know that negative reinforcement is the removal of a stimulus contingent on behavior that increases the likelihood of that behavior occurring in the future. And the answer is there needs to be an aversive stimulus present prior to behavior occurring, or else the removal of that stimulus would not be reinforcing. So when we talk about negative reinforcement, we're essentially talking about those escape contingencies. So you have a situation where an aversive stimulus is present. So a response will occur because in the past that has resulted in removal of that aversive stimulus. If that aversive stimulus is not present, why on earth would you engage in the response? Because nothing would necessarily, nothing would happen. Another thing that we think about with escape is avoidance contingencies. And avoidance contingencies will, well, honestly, just to start, avoidance is behavior that's occurred because in the past it has resulted in the delay of some aversive stimulus. So, if you have a situation where you have an escape contingency in the presence of an aversive stimulus, you engage in a response and that response has been removed, then you may start to also or avoidance responding may also start to be conditioned. And there's two types of avoidance, but typically what people talk about is discriminated avoidance, where you have something that happens, a WS, a warning stimulus, that happens before that aversive stimulus that we talked about in the escape contingency. So something that happens immediately before and always happens immediately before. And then what might come to happen is in the presence of that warning stimulus, a response will occur and that aversive stimulus will never happen. However, if there's no warning stimulus, the response occurs, then the aversive stimulus might happen or nothing might happen. But it's that warning stimulus, it's a discrimination training that might occur that would result in avoidance responding. It's important to really pull those two apart. And if you notice, the result of avoidance is no presentation of an aversive stimulus as opposed to the result of escape was, if we remember, the removal of the aversive stimulus. So in order for escape to occur, the aversive stimulus has to be present. However, in order to for avoidance to occur, there is no presence of the aversive stimulus. Avoidance is actually a more complex contingency, or there are more complex contingencies suggested to be around avoidance responding than we think about at first. We're going to talk a little bit more about this next week when we talked about some condition motivating operations. But it's important at least to be able to distinguish between escape and avoidance pretty clearly. But they're both considered to be forms of negative reinforcement. With all of that information about reinforcement, here's lecture check-in number 1. So take your time to determine which of the following sentences is correct. All right, and I hope everyone picked D. That when the sun shines in my eyes, I pull down my sunglasses because in the past that resulted in negative reinforcement, or that behavior had been negatively reinforced. This kind of gets to something that we talked about last week when we talked about the respondent conditioning that the sun, the initial reflexive relationship was that the sun elicited a I think it was an eye water response, right? So that would be the reflexive relation. That would also be what would happen with respondent conditioning. However, that sun would also potentially be an aversive stimulus that would, whose removal or which removal would reinforce behavior. So blocking out the sun would be a negative reinforcer for putting sunglasses on. The reasons, let's go through the other ones. So talking about option A, where negative reinforcement is only effective for some forms of behavior, we already talked about that it might be difficult to arrange contingencies in order to negatively reinforce behavior. However, the form is not more or less sensitive to reinforcement. For option B, where it suggests that avoidance only happens if an organism knows an aversive stimulus is coming, that it's not the knowing. There's no knowing necessary. It's because in the past, a warning stimulus followed an aversive stimulus, or that in the past there was likelihood that an aversive stimulus was likely to occur. So it's not knowing, it's the past sequence of the variables. And then 3, you always need a cat example. So my cat was positively reinforced when I pet him following jumping on my lap. I hope no one thought that C was the answer, because my cat is never reinforced. His lap jumping behavior may be reinforced, but not the cat. All right, so let's move into punishment. Sorry, I wanted to give you a chance to write down the definition for punishment here, but my animation didn't seem to work. So for punishment, we all are pretty familiar with punishment being a stimulus change contingent on behavior that decreases the probability that behavior will occur in the future. Very important. So thinking about a pretty seminal example of punishment, that if the situation where our little rat friend was pressing a lever that had resulted in food, if you change the contingencies and pressing the lever results in shock and the rat ceases to press the lever, punishment has occurred. And again, that punishment is just like reinforcement, where it is the principle of when these things happen, behavior decreases, that is punishment. The presentation or removal of the stimulus would be the punisher. So in this case, the shock was the punisher. So in terms of our human behavior, we have a very similar example from last time, and you're going to let me know, or let yourselves know, whether or not this is an example of punishment. My hope is that everybody determined that this is not an example of punishment, that even though when you touch the light switch there was a small shock delivered, that there's something missing from this definition. The stimulus change is there, the shock, right? The touching the light switch is the behavior. However, what is missing is that behavior decreased in the future. This is a kind of good example because I think that this is something that might happen to a lot of people. However, it doesn't necessarily decrease your light turning on behavior or your moving your hand on the light switch behavior. So it's absolutely imperative to have the behavior change, just like reinforcement. Also, like reinforcement, there are a number of things you should already know. For instance, what type 1 and type 2 punishment are. So what is type 1 punishment? Or what would be another word for type 1 punishment? That's right, positive punishment. So with positive or type 1 punishment, we understand that the stimulus change that's contingent on behavior is the addition, presentation, or addition of some stimulus that results in a decrease in behavior. That would lead to type 2 punishment being negative punishment, where the removal of a stimulus would punish behavior and make it less likely that behavior would occur in the future. Some other things that you should know, just like reinforcement, there are conditioned and unconditioned punishers. Here, I think the pictures may be a little abstract, so let's just talk through them. The largest universal punisher, or some people say the only universal punisher is electric shock. That the stimulus that will result in decreased behavior, or the presentation of that stimulus will result in decreased behavior, is not learned at all. That regardless of learning history, shock will, when presented contingently, will decrease the future probability of that behavior. However, vocal reprimands or reprimands, if they actually are punishers, which frequently they are not, right? We need our assessment to determine whether or not they are effective punishers. But if they are, it's because they've been conditioned, potentially paired with some other punishing event. Another thing you should know, well, this is an incorrect statement. I apologize. All right, so my slideshow got a little messed up, but I do want to make the points that punishment has some of the same considerations as reinforcement, where there is automaticity of punishment. It is not necessary for someone to know or understand or to have discriminated the contingencies in order for punishment to occur. A number of my own behaviors have been punished, and I was not, quote unquote, aware of it. Also, when you talk about punishment, you're talking about the past, just like reinforcement. So it's not that I no longer bite my nails because I know that it will result in a bad taste in my mouth if I use some type of ipecac. It's I no longer bite my nails because in the past biting my nails have been followed by a bad taste in my mouth. Also, most behaviors are sensitive to punishment unless there is some type of physiological reason that those behaviors occur. And at that point, sometimes rates of responding may decrease, or the frequency of responding may decrease, but never to zero levels. All right, now let's get into a couple other things. Like we talked about the unwanted side effects of reinforcement, there are a number of unwanted side effects of punishment that when we talk about advanced applications in our last module will be very, very important to consider. And anytime you're implementing a punishment procedure, it's really important that you pay attention to all of these side effects. So first, when punishment occurs or when there's a punishment program implemented, there may be elicited responses. So I hope everybody is really honing in on that E word, elicited. So from that, we would guess, or no, hypothesize, right, that the meaning of elicited means that it is either a response that is a reflexive response or has been conditioned through respondent conditioning. Typically with punishment, what we're looking at is elicited emotional responding or elicited aggression. Very important that this may happen as a result of punishment. Another potential unwanted side effect of punishment is that you may be conditioning other punishers, or other punishers may be conditioned. Any stimuli that are in the presence of the aversive stimulus or the stimulus that is resulting in the punishment may be paired with that punishment and punisher and become punishers themselves. This is really important because participants or clients or whoever's behavior is being punished may start engaging in escape and avoidance behaviors where they try to escape and or avoid the area where punishment is occurring, the people who are delivering punishers, or any of the variables that are occurring. So thinking about a situation with clients that if a punishment procedure is being implemented in a clinic setting or in a school setting, they may come to engage in escape and avoidance behaviors because the variables related to school in general have become aversive. So it's really important to consider that. In addition, thinking about the people who are implementing a punishment procedure or delivering the punisher, that may be negatively reinforced. So increased punishment delivery or implementation of the punishment program, or generalization may occur. So we find it very frequently that with parents of young children, if they have a situation where they're looking to decrease a specific behavior, say whining, they may implement a timeout procedure. And then if that timeout procedure works, what they'll see is a decrease in whining, or if you put the if you implement timeout and the whining stops, it may negatively reinforce their behavior, so they'll increase the use of timeout. Again, and very important to pay attention to and mitigate. Another potential unwanted side effect is there may be an increase in other responses. So whenever a punishment procedure is run, or whenever a behavior is punished, that does not mean that whatever had reinforced that behavior is no longer available, or no longer valuable. So for instance, if I engage in whining behavior because in the past it has been followed by attention from a parent, and now some punishment procedure has been implemented, that doesn't make that attention any less valuable. So there is going to be an increase in some behavior that will result in that reinforcer. Another behavior, or another potential unwanted side effect of punishment, is that the implementation of a punishment procedure or delivery of a punisher may be modeling unwanted behavior. So that if we're modeling, or if there is a model occurring, there's the potential for imitation. So not that this occurs as often anymore as it did in the future. However, there were reports that when parents would implement a spanking punishment procedure, that increased hitting or spanking, may occur from the child. It's important to consider the potential for modeling. And I believe this is the last one, behavioral contrast. And behavioral contrast is something that's really important to consider with a number of different procedures, especially punishment procedures. With behavioral contrast, what we're interested in is that when a punisher or a punishment procedure is implemented in one context, the behavior will, if it's a true punisher, decrease in that context. However, like we said, the reinforcement that had been maintaining that response is not less valuable, so you will see increase in other contexts. This increased behavior is really, really important to consider. The example I have below is actually in regards to reinforcement, where if you implement a change in reinforcement in one setting, that you may see a decrease in behavior in another setting. In terms of punishment, if you see a decrease in responding in one setting, you're very likely to see an increase in another setting. And this is something that we know occurs, has been demonstrated experimentally, you're going to read about. And so it's something that needs to be planned for. All of the unwanted side effects of punishment need to be planned for and mitigated during any punishment procedure that is run. There are a couple concepts related to consequences that are true for all consequences. The first is, or that integrate both reinforcement and punishment. The first is the concept of aversiveness. So aversive control occurs in a few different contexts. One, behavior that is positively punished. Two, behavior that is negatively reinforced. And three, situations of avoidance behavior. And so when we talk about aversive, a stimulus is aversive that will occur in one of these three occasions. In terms of positive punishment, the punishment occurs because an aversive stimulus is added to the to the situation following behavior. The reason we know it's aversive is because the behavior decreases. So if positive punishment has occurred, this is a situation of aversive control because the stimulus has to be considered aversive. In terms of negative reinforcement, like we talked about before, in order for a stimulus to be removed, that stimulus needs to be present prior to behavior occurring. That stimulus, by definition, is aversive because it results in negative reinforcement. Lastly, avoidance. There needs to be some situation where an aversive stimulus repeatedly occurs in order for behavior to result in or increase that will be reinforced by the repeated avoidance of that responding. That stimulus, again, has to be aversive. So when we talk about aversive control, it's not just positive punishment. Negative reinforcement and avoidance result in the same aversive control. And aversive stimuli are involved in each of these three situations. For both punishment and reinforcement, it's important to consider parameters of the consequences. Some of the parameters, or the parameters that you typically really need to consider, are one, the immediacy of reinforcement or punishment. A number of experiments have demonstrated that the closer the stimulus change is temporally to the behavior, the greater effect it's going to have on the behavior. Additionally, the more delayed, the less potential effect it'll have, if any. Thinking about what we talked about with schedule-induced behavior, any behavior that occurs in between the response and the consequence could actually contact that consequence, while the target or the other behavior may not. Very important consideration with each. You may wind up punishing a behavior that happens following the behavior you actually want to punish, or vice versa, reinforce behavior that happens closer to the reinforcer. A second parameter is the magnitude. Other words that you might use for this are the intensity or strength of the consequence. This is important for both reinforcement and punishment. For reinforcement, the magnitude needs to meet or balance out the response effort. So for some of us, we would engage in picking up a book that resulted in $1. However, we would not engage in running a marathon that resulted in $1. Magnitude of reinforcement. And this will actually get to concepts that we're going to talk about in later modules called delay discounting that will lead to behavioral economics as well. For punishment, same thing, that the magnitude, the intensity of the punisher needs to be enough that it will actually punish the response of interest. For punishment, when we talk about advanced application, what's going to be really important is that we don't slowly increase the magnitude of the punisher until we find the correct magnitude, but that we start with an intense enough punisher right from the beginning. So this could be the, well, you know, we've been using shock, so the intensity of the shock, but also considering the number of minutes or the number of things taken away for a response cost, the duration or the loudness of a reprimand. A lot of things could be included within magnitude for both reinforcement and punishment. The schedules of reinforcement and schedules of punishment are really important. I know that many of you have learned about the simple schedules of reinforcement, but I've also included a PowerPoint that goes into the more complex schedules of reinforcement in the Blackboard folder. There's no audio that goes along with it, but it just gives definitions for all of the different schedules that are possible. the schedule, what we're really talking about is what's the frequency of reinforcement or punishment, how often is it delivered. And there are a lot of things that are really just a result of the schedule of reinforcement or punishment. So for instance, we know that an FR, a fixed ratio schedule, is really predictable and can result in quick acquisition of behavior. However, it's also not very resistant to extinction. So the strength of the behavior is not as much as a variable schedule. With punishment, we also know that the more frequent and more predictable a punisher occurs, the quicker it will result in decrease. However, once that punisher is removed, the behavior may occur quicker. The quality of the reinforcer and punisher is really important as well. So thinking about a situation that where your behavior has been reinforced because of access to YouTube. If it's YouTube that is involving more commercial time than access to your preferred clip, then the YouTube access may not be as strong a reinforcer. So it's really important to pay attention to that quality of reinforcement. And lastly, the novelty. Sorry, couldn't say that word for a second. So the novelty of reinforcement, right? How often access is given. And that will lead into motivation next week. So now we have made it to lecture check-in number 2. Again, going for the which statement is true. However, it's which statement is true about the similarity between different types of consequences. Important to know before jumping into this question, by outcome, it means the effect on behavior. And by stimulus change, it's going to mean what type of stimulus change, presentation or removal. So take a second to read through the options and determine what you think is the correct answer. And again, I hope you selected D. And so for D, we know that positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement have the same outcome because they both result in an increase in behavior. Look, going through the other options, positive punishment and positive reinforcement have the same stimulus change, where it's both a stimulus being presented. However, the outcome is different. With positive punishment, there's a decrease, and with positive reinforcement, there's an increase. In regards to option letter B, positive and negative punishment do not have the same type of stimulus change. They do have the same outcome, a decrease in behavior. However, positive punishment has a stimulus change that is the addition of a stimulus, as opposed to negative punishment where the stimulus is removed. And then for option C, positive punishment and negative reinforcement, they both involve aversive stimuli. However, positive punishment results in a decrease in behavior and negative reinforcement results in an increase in behavior. You should be able to put all of the potential consequences together and determine how they are similar and how they are different. This may be an extra step to make sure that you're really, really fluent with these concepts. I know it's easy to say, I know this, I get this, but if you cannot engage in this level of analysis, it would be worthwhile to do that. So lastly, we're going to talk about concurrent schedules in the matching law. Concurrent schedules are part of that PowerPoint presentation that is included in Blackboard, but it's important to understand concurrent schedules when we talk about the matching law briefly. So when we talk about concurrent schedules, it's two schedules that are simultaneously presented where there are going to be different ways of responding that will result in different schedules of reinforcement. So it's two schedules that are concurrent. They are running at the same time, and technically it's two or more schedules that are running at the same time. They have nothing to do with each other except that an organism can allocate the responding to one or the other. So some examples, thinking about a situation where mom will provide access to TV contingent on responding, or asking her, at a rate of, or on a schedule of like a VI 1 hour, and dad will grant access upon asking on a schedule of VI 5 hour. So you have two schedules, and most likely sometimes you'll ask mom, sometimes you'll ask dad. However, they're going to be different schedules. An example, I know that the Wii is not typically used for very many people, but different games in the Nintendo Wii will result in different schedules of, I think it's gem allocation or point allocation, right? So if those are reinforcers, you'll engage in the different games based on different schedules of gems or points. They're happening at the same exact time, and you can allocate your responding to whichever you would like. However, the different schedules of reinforcement are different. So that gets us to the matching law, and I'm actually gonna, so the matching law is something that you talked about in a narrow fashion in behavior assessment. And what it's looking at is the allocation of responding to these different concurrent schedules. However, the matching law is actually a mathematical equation that describes that relationship between the rate of responding and the rate of reinforcement. This is the equation, and you're going to read an article that'll go kind of further into this. However, what you want to be thinking about is that the matching law really does predict. It's a prediction of the consistent relationship between those two things. So when you have that concurrent schedule, you'll be able to predict the allocation of responding based on the schedules that are in play. And the way this happens is because the matching law really does describe the proportional allocation of responding to two or more different schedules. So the important word here is proportional. So in a situation where you have one schedule that is a FI 3-minute schedule and another schedule that is an FI 6-minute schedule, you will allocate twice as many responses to the FI 3-minute schedule as you will to the FI 6, because you're twice as likely to contact reinforcement on that schedule. However, you will still allocate responding to the FI 6 because you're going to maximize your reinforcement. So you'll respond on the FI 3 and then the FI 3 again, and then the FI 6, so that you're going to maximize your reinforcement. And that's what the matching law predicts, is that the allocation of responding will really maximize reinforcement by allocating responding to the schedules proportionally, not solely. So thinking about two situations where the matching law may occur. If you have the access to books and access to iPads, and this could occur at the library. So if you are able to access a book every day from the library, but you're only able to access the iPad every week from the library, you'll engage in proportional allocation. So we know that a day is 7 times more than a week. So you will allocate your responding 7 times more to the book schedule than the iPad schedule. Another example is if there is one schedule of reinforcement in one room versus another room. So a situation where a child may have access to their chosen TV show every half hour in the room where their siblings do not watch TV, so say the living room, and then have access every hour where their parents watch TV, say the den, they'll be twice as likely to go to the living room where they can watch their show every half hour. And however, they'll still half the amount of time go to the room with their parents. So what it comes down to is with the matching law, the important things to consider are that it's the proportional allocation, that responding doesn't stop. And the reason that responding doesn't stop is because the matching law only is relevant to interval schedules. So when we talk about interval schedules, we talk about schedules where reinforcement occurs after the first response following an interval. So for our books, it's a day goes by and the checking out of the library behavior contacts reinforcement. The week goes by and checking out the iPad contacts reinforcement. It's not every I go to the checkout desk 7 times and then reinforcement occurs. It's the time. And that's what's important. So you can go each day and contact reinforcement, or your book checking out can contact reinforcement, and still go after 7 days and iPad will contact reinforcement. So that's why interval schedules are really important to consider. If it was just that every time you went into the living room, you could get access to your preferred TV show, and then every third time you went into the den, you could get access to your TV show, you really wouldn't go into the den at all. You would just allocate all your responding to the living room. So for ratio schedules, the matching law really doesn't apply. So those are the two things you want to consider: is an interval schedule and is the allocation of responding proportional to the schedule. We'll get more time to practice this and read about it in the readings this week, but I wanted to give you a quick glimpse at what you will be reading. So that's it for this lecture. It was a lot of kind of different disjointed information, all having to do with consequences. But it should bring your readings together and also help highlight any areas of weakness. If those areas of weakness are things that you're concerned about, make sure to contact me and we'll figure out a way for you to get up to date. Also make sure to contact those Cooper chapters and any readings in addition to the PowerPoint with the schedules of reinforcement. So have a great week, and I look forward to the discussion board this week.